never thought a simple game of catch in the backyard could change my life forever. One moment I was laughing, feeling the sun warm on my face, and the next I was screaming in pain, clutching my wrist as it throbbed like it was on fire. My stepfather just stood there, silent, while my mom muttered something that still haunts me to this day. It's a family secret. Don't make a fuss. But secrets, I was learning, had a way of speaking louder than words, or even x-rays. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emily Harper, and I grew up in the quiet suburbs of Cedar Ridge, a place where everyone knew your name, but no one ever really knew your story. I was 15 when this happened, caught in that awkward stretch between childhood and the responsibilities of being almost an adult. I had an older brother, Jason, who was already in high school, and a younger sister, Lily, who was just 10 and blissfully unaware of the tension that simmered just below the surface in our home. My mom, Vanessa, was a gentle woman by nature, or at least that's how she presented herself to the outside world. She had this way of smiling through everything, but behind closed doors, I could feel the weight of unspoken rules, unsaid apologies, and her unrelenting desire to keep the peace no matter the cost. My stepfather, Mark, had been in our lives for almost 3 years by the time the incident happened. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a booming voice that could command attention, but it wasn't his presence that made me uneasy. It was the way he could go from charm to anger in a heartbeat. On good days, he was fun, taking us on weekend trips to the lake or teaching Jason how to throw a baseball properly. But the bad days, the days that felt like walking on a minefield, were far too frequent. He had a sharp temper, and it seemed to linger, waiting for any misstep to trigger. My mom, ever the peacemaker, would often brush things off, insisting we all keep it in the family and avoid making waves. That phrase, family secret, would later become a bitter reminder of what silence can cost. It all started on a Saturday afternoon in early June. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the sky stretched out in a perfect blue canvas, almost taunting me with its beauty. Jason had gone over to a friend's house, leaving me and Lily to entertain ourselves. Mark suggested we play catch in the backyard. At first, it seemed harmless enough. I grabbed the ball and tossed it gently toward him, trying to keep things light. Lily clapped and giggled, running between us, her laughter a fragile shield against the tension that always seemed to hover around Mark. I remember thinking, maybe today will be different. But then the throw went wrong. I tripped on the uneven patch of grass near the fence, and the ball slipped from my hands. Mark lunged to catch it, and in a split second, his elbow caught my wrist. The pain was immediate, sharp, and unrelenting, like my arm had been shattered from the inside out. I fell to the ground screaming, and Lily froze, her small hands covering her mouth as if the sheer act of watching could make it stop. Mark didn't move. He just stood there, his face a mask of something I couldn't identify. Was it regret? Anger? Or something darker that I wasn't ready to name? My mom, Vanessa, rushed out the back door, her expression unreadable. "Emily, calm down," she said softly, but her tone was tinged with that familiar edge that suggested calm was the last thing she intended to offer. I could barely speak, tears streaming down my face, every heartbeat sending another jolt of fire through my wrist. Mark muttered something about accidents, but it didn't sound convincing even to my own ears. Vanessa knelt beside me, placing her hands on my shoulders and whispered, it's okay. We'll keep it between us. Family secret, remember?" I shook my head violently, trying to get the words out, but all I could manage was a strangled sob. I wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge what had just happened, but all I got was that chilling reminder that our home had rules I didn't understand yet. The truth stayed hidden, no matter the pain it caused. We ended up in the emergency room because the swelling in my wrist was unmistakable. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, cold and impersonal, casting a clinical pall over the chaos of my emotions. Mark hovered in the background, pretending to text on his phone, while my mom clutched my hand, repeating over and over that it would be fine, that the doctors would just look at it and everything would be okay. But when the X-ray technician finally slid the image onto the screen, my breath caught. The wrist wasn't just sprained, it was fractured, the bone clearly misaligned, the jagged edges impossible to ignore. The image screamed what my family had tried to silence. For a brief, piercing moment, the truth stared back at us in black and white. I could feel my anger rising, a tide threatening to wash away the careful masks everyone wore. But even then, my mom's reaction was telling. Instead of anger toward Mark or concern for me, she said quietly, almost apologetically, "Emily, sometimes families have secrets. Some things are better left unspoken." Her words were meant to soothe, but they felt like shackles tightening around my chest. I realized in that sterile hospital room that this wasn't just about a broken wrist. It was about years of hidden tension, of unspoken abuse, of a family willing to prioritize appearances over safety. I clenched my jaw and made a silent promise to myself. This story would not end in silence. As the doctor adjusted my cast and gave instructions for recovery, I stared at the X-ray again, imagining the sharp line of the fracture like a metaphor for everything that had been hidden in our home. The pain in my wrist was real, but so was the pain in my chest, the ache of realizing that those who were supposed to protect me had chosen secrecy over justice. That day, a spark ignited in me, a determination that the truth, no matter how frightening, would eventually speak louder than any whispered family secret. After the hospital visit, returning home felt surreal, as if stepping back into a familiar house had become an entirely new experience. My wrist throbbed continuously, the cast heavy and awkward, a physical reminder of everything that had happened. Lily clung to me like I was her lifeline, asking every 5 minutes if I was hurting, while Jason avoided eye contact entirely, pretending not to notice, or maybe just unsure how to react. Mom, Vanessa, carried on with her usual routine, making dinner, folding laundry, reminding Lily to do her homework. But there was an invisible tension in the air, a fragile bubble of normalcy that I knew could shatter with the slightest disturbance. Every glance at Mark, who lounged in the living room pretending to read the newspaper, made my stomach tighten. There was a silent acknowledgement in his presence, an unspoken, "Don't tell anyone," and the familiarity of that suppression only fueled my growing unease. Life at home continued as though nothing had happened, which was the most frightening part. Every day I attended school, smiled for teachers, and laughed with friends, but inside I felt the hollow ache of isolation. I could no longer ignore the way my family functioned like a stage production, everyone performing their part to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. At school, I tried to focus on my art assignments and English essays, but my thoughts always drifted back to the casted wrist and the X-ray that had betrayed our family's carefully constructed narrative. Even simple tasks like writing, tying my shoes, or carrying my backpack were now battles, constant reminders of a body and a life that didn't feel fully my own anymore. My mom insisted I rest more than usual, claiming it was for my wrist, but I noticed the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, an expression that was part worry about what others might think if anyone knew. Vanessa had always been protective in her own way, but I realized her protection came with rules I couldn't follow. "Don't talk about it," she would whisper when Mark left the room. "No one needs to know. Family secrets are for keeping peace." Each time she said it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The phrase, once comforting in childhood stories she'd tell us at bedtime, had become sinister, a code for silence and complicity. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mark, on the other hand, was eerily quiet around me after the incident, as though the fracture had embarrassed him or reminded him of something he preferred to forget. He never apologized, never acknowledged the incident directly, and never offered any sign of empathy.
Instead, he would make little jokes about me being fragile or clumsy in front of Jason and Lily, forcing laughs that felt hollow. I tried to respond politely, smiling weakly, but inside a storm of confusion and fear brewed. I wanted to scream at him, demand recognition for what had happened, but the weight of my mother's words held me back. Family secrets were more than just words. They were rules, and breaking them felt like crossing a line too dangerous to approach. School offered no relief either. Teachers noticed I was moving awkwardly, favoring my right arm, but when I tried to explain, I could only give the generic response, I fell. No one asked further. Friends would glance at my cast, offer sympathy, and then move on, their curiosity politely contained. It was like the world had decided to accept my injury as a minor inconvenience, rather than an alarm signal. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. Even I had been trained to ignore the deeper truth, to accept the surface-level explanation and keep moving. Yet each day, the pain in my wrist throbbed in tandem with the growing weight of suppressed emotions, and I began to feel a quiet desperation.
The fracture, it turned out, was only the first crack in the illusion my family had worked so hard to maintain. In the following weeks, I noticed little things. The way my mother flinched when Mark raised his voice, even over trivial matters. The hurried way Jason avoided the subject entirely when I tried to ask what had happened during the accident. The sharp looks Lily would give Mark when he barked at her for something minor. Everyone was walking on eggshells, performing their part in a silent dance designed to protect appearances. I couldn't help but realize that my mother's insistence on secrecy wasn't about protecting me. It was about preserving the image of a family that didn't exist in reality. Late one evening, when the house was quiet and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, I tried talking to my mom again. "Mom," I said gently, gripping the armrest of the couch with my uninjured hand, "why is it always a secret? Why can't anyone know the truth?" She sighed deeply, her eyes avoiding mine, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Emily," she said softly, almost like a warning, "sometimes it's better if things stay within the family. People don't understand the nuances. They judge too quickly." But her voice faltered near the end, and I caught the flicker of something, guilt? Fear? That she couldn't completely mask. That moment told me everything I needed to know. The fracture was only the visible symptom. The hidden abuse, the silences, the complicity, all of it was a much deeper wound. In the weeks that followed, I became more aware of the subtle patterns of control Mark exercised and the ways my mom allowed it to continue. It was in the sharp words he directed at us for no reason, the unspoken rules about how we were supposed to behave, the way our home felt like a minefield where one wrong move could provoke anger. Even small acts of kindness from him felt like calculated moves to maintain dominance rather than genuine affection. I began to keep a mental log of incidents, moments that would otherwise be dismissed or forgotten, realizing that the fracture was the first undeniable evidence of a pattern that had been there long before I could recognize it. By the end of that first month, my home had settled back into its facade of normalcy, but I no longer saw it that way. I could feel the tension in every corner, hear the unspoken rules echoing in my mind, and understand the true meaning of the phrase my mom kept repeating, family secret. It wasn't protection, it was a warning, a code for compliance. And with each passing day, I felt the urgency building inside me, the need to not only acknowledge the truth, but eventually confront it, no matter the consequences. The fracture had opened more than just my wrist. It had cracked the door to a hidden reality that could no longer be ignored. By late July, the uneasy rhythm of our household had begun to fray even further, and I could feel it in the small, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior around me. My wrist was healing slowly, but the emotional bruise from that first fracture remained raw. I tried to focus on schoolwork, art projects, and helping Lily with her summer assignments, but it felt like walking through a fog that no sunlight could penetrate. Every time I looked at Mark, every time I saw my mom quickly avert her eyes, I felt a pulse of tension ripple through my chest.
I had begun to notice things that I had ignored before. Bruises on my brother's arms, the way Lily flinched whenever Mark raised his voice, the subtle way Mom adjusted the thermostat, turned up the TV, or created distractions whenever Mark's temper rose. It was like watching pieces of a puzzle I wasn't supposed to see, but now I couldn't unsee them. The incident that finally forced me to break through the wall of silent endurance happened on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. I had been tasked with tidying the garage, a space I usually avoided because it was dim, cluttered, and smelled strongly of oil and mildew. Mark had been working on an old motorcycle that Jason occasionally helped him with, but I mostly stayed on the edges, trying to make myself useful without drawing attention. That day, though, I reached for a box of tools stacked precariously on a shelf. Before I could steady it, it tipped over, and one of the heavier wrenches slipped from my hands. Mark turned sharply, his face immediately darkening. "Emily, watch what you're doing!" His voice was sharp, reverberating against the garage walls. I apologized quickly, my heart hammering, trying to explain it was an accident, but he didn't seem to hear me. In a flash, he grabbed my wrist. Not in play, not in guidance, but with a force that made me yelp in pain. The wrist that had barely healed from the last fracture was pushed and twisted unnaturally. I stumbled back, clutching it, and felt a familiar, sickening burn. I could see my mom in the doorway, frozen, her lips pressed tightly together. Instead of stepping forward, she just shook her head slightly, mouthing the words, "Family secret." My chest tightened, and tears stung my eyes, not just from the pain, but from the crushing realization that the people who were supposed to protect me had already chosen the path of silence and concealment.
After Mark stormed out of the garage, slamming the door behind him, I sank to the floor, gripping my arm and trying to catch my breath. Lily ran in, her small hands trembling, asking if I was okay, while Jason hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. Mom eventually approached, her expression a careful mask of concern, and helped me sit up. She murmured, "It's all right, Emily. You will be fine. Accidents happen." But her words were empty. I could feel it in her body language, in the way she refused to call for medical help immediately, in the way she tried to sweep the incident under the rug. That's when something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about me anymore, and pretending it was just a mistake was no longer an option. The very next morning, I made the decision to insist on a proper medical checkup. I called our family doctor, using my own voice to explain the previous fracture and the new incident. Mom argued softly, trying to dissuade me, but I stood my ground. "I need an X-ray," I said firmly. "This isn't just a bruise, and I'm not ignoring it this time." My determination surprised even me, but I knew I couldn't allow the pattern of silence to continue. That day at the clinic, the nurse led me to a small room and explained the procedure, while Mom hovered silently in the corner, glancing anxiously at her phone. The technician positioned my wrist carefully and snapped the images. And then the waiting began, the uncomfortable, torturous minutes before the doctor would review the X-rays. When the doctor finally appeared, holding the images up against the light, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. The words came slowly, deliberately. "Emily, this is serious. Your wrist is fractured again, and it's a clean break this time. It's crucial we understand how this happened, because repeated injuries like this are not normal." My breath caught. I wanted to speak, to explain it was an accident, but the truth was bigger than a single misstep. I glanced at Mom, expecting support, but she looked away, her fingers twisting in nervous agitation. The X-ray didn't lie, and yet it seemed like she was trying to erase the undeniable truth with her eyes. That moment, the doctor's calm but firm voice, combined with the cold, incontrovertible proof of the fracture, was the breaking point. I realized that the old way of ignoring, hiding, and protecting Mark at the expense of my safety was no longer viable. This wasn't just about a single incident anymore. It was a pattern, a dangerous one, and the only way forward was to confront it. I felt a surge of anger, fear, and determination all at once. The X-ray was more than a medical image. It was a testament to the truth that my family had tried to bury under layers of denial, excuses, and family secrets. On the drive home, I remained silent, gripping my casted wrist as though it were a lifeline. Mom tried to start a conversation, but I barely responded. My mind was already racing, forming plans, considering options I had never allowed myself to imagine before. I realized that the fracture had inadvertently given me the leverage I needed, the proof that could no longer be dismissed. I couldn't ignore it, and neither could my mom if she truly cared about our family's well-being. This was my chance to break the cycle of silence, even if it meant shaking the foundations of our household. That day, I made a silent vow to myself. I would not let this family secret continue to harm anyone, especially not me or my siblings. The fracture had revealed the truth in a way that words never could. And as I looked at the X-ray, the clean line across my wrist, I understood that some truths, once visible, demand action. That image would haunt me, yes, but it would also empower me. For the first time, I felt like I had a reason to fight, not just for myself, but for the justice and safety that had been denied to all of us. After the second fracture, it became increasingly impossible to maintain the illusion of normalcy in our home. I spent the next few days mostly in my room, resting and avoiding Mark as much as possible, but despite my attempts to retreat, the truth had begun to leak out in ways I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, while I was quietly sketching in my notebook, the doorbell rang. Mom opened the door and was greeted by a tall woman in a sharp, professional outfit, Detective Rachel Monroe, a local child welfare investigator I had never met before. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively stiffened. Rachel had that calm authority in her presence, the kind that made it clear that she had already seen too much to be intimidated by polite smiles or quiet denials. Vanessa stepped aside to let her in, her hands trembling slightly, as if she knew that the walls she had carefully built around the family's secrets were about to crumble.
Detective Monroe introduced herself in a soft but firm voice. I received a report regarding potential repeated injuries in your household. I'd like to ask a few questions, she said, looking directly at me. The way she said it left no room for evasions or half-truths. My mom's lips pressed together, and I could see the conflict flicker in her eyes, loyalty to Mark battling the instinct to protect her child. Mark, who had just entered the living room, froze mid-step, his newspaper falling to the floor as he noticed the stranger standing there. His face went from mild annoyance to a tense, unreadable mask. I realized in that moment that Detective Monroe was exactly the outside perspective that could no longer be ignored, the first set of eyes ready to pierce through the veil of our family's silence. Rachel asked to see my wrist and review the X-ray from the previous visit. Mom hesitated, muttering something about how it was probably just a minor accident and that the doctor had cleared it, but Detective Monroe's presence had a quiet authority that made hesitation feel inadequate. "It's important for Emily's safety that I see the evidence," she said plainly. Reluctantly, Mom handed over the paperwork. I could feel my pulse quicken as Monroe examined the images, her brow furrowing slightly as she compared the two fractures. "These injuries are concerning," she noted softly, almost more to herself than anyone else, especially considering the short time frame between them. Her words, clinical and measured, carried a weight that hit me in the chest. The truth I had been whispering to myself for weeks was finally being recognized by someone outside my home. Mark tried to interject, attempting to downplay the severity. "It's nothing, she's just clumsy," he said, his voice pitched a little higher than normal, betraying tension. Monroe didn't flinch. She looked at him with calm precision, her eyes not accusatory but unwavering. "Clumsiness doesn't explain repeated fractures in the same limb," she said, turning back to me. "Emily, can you tell me exactly what happened each time?" I swallowed hard, realizing the magnitude of the moment. For the first time, I wasn't just recounting the events to my mother, who had insisted on silence. I was telling the truth to someone who could act on it, who could see beyond the surface, who could finally acknowledge the reality I had been living in. I explained, slowly, starting with the first fracture, describing the games, the falls, and how Mark's actions had caused the injuries. I noticed Monroe taking meticulous notes, nodding occasionally, never interrupting, allowing me to speak fully without judgment or dismissal.
As I spoke, I could see the tension in my mother's shoulders relax slightly, as if hearing me tell the story aloud relieved her of some unspoken burden. But it also seemed to ignite a different kind of fear, one that I couldn't quite name yet. Mark, on the other hand, grew increasingly defensive, pacing back and forth as his attempts to control the narrative faltered. His usual tactics, intimidation, laughter, minimization, were ineffective against the calm, systematic approach of an outsider trained to see patterns of abuse. It was the first time I realized just how much power the truth could have when it was supported by evidence and witnessed by someone impartial. Detective Monroe asked me if I had ever felt unsafe at home before, if I had been hurt in ways I was afraid to tell anyone. My hands trembled as I nodded, and for the first time, I admitted that this pattern of behavior had been ongoing, not just with my wrist, but with subtle threats, anger outbursts, and moments of fear that I had learned to normalize. She listened intently, her pen moving across the notebook as she recorded every detail. "Emily, you're very brave for sharing this," she said quietly. Her acknowledgement, so simple and unassuming, felt like a lifeline. For years, I had been silenced by family rules and fear. Now, my voice mattered. The investigation didn't end there. Monroe explained the next steps. She would be filing a report, conducting follow-up interviews, and ensuring that I and my siblings were safe while the case moved forward. She left us with her contact information and instructions to reach out if anything escalated. As she walked out the door, I realized that the ripple effect had begun. The truth was no longer mine to carry alone. It had been validated externally, and the first domino had fallen. I looked at my mom, her face pale, her lips pressed together, and I could sense a mixture of fear and relief. I had no idea how she would process this in the long term, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the pattern of silence and fear was finally being challenged from the outside. That evening, I sat in my room staring at the X-ray again, reflecting on the events of the day. The presence of someone else, someone trained to recognize and respond to abuse, had changed everything, as if a spotlight had been shined into the dark corners of our home, illuminating truths that had been hidden for years. I realized that from this point forward, I couldn't ignore what had been happening. The fractures, the pain, and the secrets could no longer be contained. Outside eyes had seen the truth, and in doing so, had given me the courage and permission to begin taking the steps necessary to protect myself and my siblings.
For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. The fractures in my wrist were painful, yes, but they had also become symbols of resilience. They were evidence that abuse could leave marks, yes, but also that truth could pierce through the most tightly held secrets. As I settled into bed that night, I realized that the most important battle, the battle to acknowledge and confront the truth, had officially begun. And while I had no idea how difficult the road ahead would be, I felt the tiniest, most powerful spark of empowerment. I was no longer alone. In the days that followed Detective Monroe's visit, the atmosphere in our house grew heavier, as if her presence had disrupted some delicate balance that had always allowed Mark's temper to go unchecked. Mark became increasingly irritable, pacing through the halls, slamming doors, muttering under his breath whenever he thought I wasn't watching. I noticed the sharp glances he shot at Mum, the subtle way he tried to regain control, and the tension in every interaction. Vanessa, for her part, seemed caught in the middle, her instinct to protect her family colliding with her awareness that the situation had escalated beyond her usual control. She spent hours pacing the living room, muttering, "I just want peace," as if repeating the phrase enough times could erase what had already happened. I could feel the walls closing in, and yet, for the first time, I refused to let fear dictate my silence. At school, I became hyper-aware of the changes at home. Every ache in my wrist, every whispered argument I overheard reminded me that the fractures were more than physical. They were a symptom of something deeper. I began documenting everything, keeping a private notebook where I recorded incidents, conversations, and small observations that others might overlook. The way Mark raised his voice when Lily spilled juice. The hurried excuses Mum made when bruises appeared on Jason's arms. The moments when Mark's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I wrote in detail about the second fracture, the X-ray, and Detective Monroe's visit. The act of writing it down felt like building a silent army of evidence, preparing for the day when words alone would not suffice. Each entry was painstaking, but it also gave me a sense of control I had never had before. For the first time, the fragments of truth were starting to come together in a way I could hold on to. But gathering evidence in secret came with its own challenges. Mark began monitoring our movements more closely, his presence looming over every corner of the house. He insisted we keep the windows closed, questioned where we were going, and demanded explanations for the smallest of actions. Mum, sensing the danger, warned me not to push too hard, not to provoke him. "He's only frustrated because he cares," she said once, her voice tight with unease. I wanted to argue, to tell her that care didn't break bones, but I remained silent. The notebook became my sanctuary, a place where the truth could exist without risk, a growing testament to the reality my family had tried to conceal. One evening, a particularly volatile incident occurred that cemented my resolve. I had been helping Lily with her homework in the kitchen when Mark was fixing something in the garage. A minor disagreement about a math problem sparked a tirade from him, his anger escalating faster than I had anticipated. He slammed his hand against the counter, rattling dishes and startling Lily. My wrist throbbed in protest from even the small movements I had made during the scuffle, and I felt the familiar surge of fear that had haunted me for weeks. Mum intervened, pleading with him to calm down, but he snapped at her too, his voice a low growl. That night, I lay awake, listening to their muffled arguments, and I realized that the danger wasn't just physical. It was psychological, a constant, invisible pressure that eroded any sense of safety in our home.
In parallel, I continued compiling evidence from the hospital and previous x-rays. I kept copies of doctor's notes, detailing the timeline of my injuries, and I even began photographing small bruises and marks that appeared on my siblings over time. It was painstaking, and each action carried the risk of discovery, but I felt a growing sense of empowerment with every piece of evidence collected. The notebook, the photos, the doctor's reports. They were no longer just records, they were armor. A way to protect myself and my siblings while preparing for the confrontation that would inevitably come. As the week progressed, I began noticing subtle changes in how Mark interacted with us. His jokes became sharper, less playful. His attempts at charm were forced, almost desperate. I realized he sensed the shift, the invisible threat posed by the documentation and external awareness. Meanwhile, Mom grew quieter, more thoughtful, her own internal conflict visible in the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking. I could sense the tension in the household building, a pressure that made every small interaction a potential powder keg. By the end of that week, I understood something critical. The truth was no longer a secret I could carry alone, nor was it something Mark could continue to control through fear and intimidation. The evidence was mounting. The opposition was aware, but unable to fully suppress it, and the moment of reckoning was approaching. I felt a quiet sense of anticipation, mingled with anxiety, knowing that the coming days would require courage I had never needed before. The fractures in my wrist were no longer just physical, they were symbolic, markers of a home fractured by fear and silence. And I was finally ready to make sure that every piece of truth I had gathered would not be ignored. The moment of undeniable proof arrived on a day that had started like any other, but quickly spiraled into something that would forever change the trajectory of my life. I was sitting in my room, wrist still stiff from the cast, when the phone rang. It was Detective Monroe. Her voice, calm yet insistent, carried a weight that made my heart race. "Emily, we've received all the hospital reports, x-rays, and statements from your school counselor," she said. "I want to meet with you and your mom. There's something you both need to see." I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Something big was coming, something that couldn't be hidden or explained away. And I knew in my gut that this was the turning point I had been waiting for. Mom and I arrived at the child welfare office later that afternoon, the small building buzzing quietly with administrative activity. Monroe greeted us and led us into a conference room. She motioned for us to sit and, after a brief pause, placed a folder in front of us. "Emily, Vanessa, I want you to look at this together." I opened the folder carefully, revealing photographs, medical reports, and a series of notes that detailed every incident I had described over the past weeks. The x-rays were there, clear and unambiguous. The first fracture, the second fracture, and a startling revelation, a series of images from previous checkups that, in retrospect, suggested patterns of repeated trauma. My stomach churned as I realized just how visible the truth had become. The evidence didn't lie, and it didn't require anyone's interpretation to understand. Detective Monroe pointed to the x-rays. "Look at the alignment here," she said, tapping gently on the second fracture. "This is not an isolated incident. Emily, you have been subjected to repeated injuries in a short span of time. Vanessa, these patterns are concerning. They indicate a recurring risk that needs immediate attention." My mom's hands trembled as she leafed through the documents, her eyes widening in shock. I had expected some level of denial, some attempt to rationalize what had happened, but the visual evidence was irrefutable. The fractures spoke for themselves, louder and more clearly than any argument or excuse could. I realized then that for the first time, my mother could no longer hide behind the phrase, "family secret." The truth was staring her in the face. As I looked at her, I saw something I hadn't fully recognized before. Fear. Not the kind of fear we had lived with around Mark's temper, but a different, more profound fear. The fear of consequences, of accountability. Vanessa's lips quivered and she let out a small, almost inaudible sigh. For years, she had been complicit in silence, believing it was protection, but now the evidence forced recognition. The weight of her inaction pressed down on her visibly. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with sorrow. It was painful to see her realize the depth of what had been allowed to happen, but it was necessary. Acknowledgement was the first step towards true change. Detective Monroe didn't leave us to sit in shock. She walked us through the implications of the findings. Repeated trauma was now documented, corroborated by multiple sources, and undeniable. She explained the protocols for protective measures, the next steps in ensuring safety for my siblings and I, and how legal processes would proceed. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, tempered by anxiety for the battles that would follow. The truth was no longer an abstract concept I carried alone. It had tangible, undeniable form, and it demanded action.
As the meeting progressed, Monroe asked me to recount one more time, in detail, the incident that had led to the second fracture. Speaking aloud, with the weight of corroborating evidence behind me, felt different. I wasn't just telling a story anymore. I was presenting facts that couldn't be twisted or ignored. Every word, every description of pain and fear added clarity to the image Monroe had already built from the x-rays and reports. I noticed Mom leaning forward slightly, her expression a mix of disbelief, guilt, and dawning understanding. For the first time, I felt the fragile but crucial shift. My voice, once suppressed, now carried the weight of truth, and it was being heard and validated by someone with authority and the power to act. Leaving the office that day, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and empowerment. The evidence had crystallized the truth in a way that words alone could never have achieved. The fractures in my wrist, once a source of pain and fear, had become symbols of undeniable reality. For the first time, the family secret felt powerless. The x-rays, the medical reports, and my documented experiences had dismantled the protective illusion that had shielded Mark and trapped Mom in silence.
Walking to the car, I caught my mother's eye. There was a quiet acknowledgement there, a recognition that she could no longer ignore what had happened and that change was necessary. Over the next few days, word of the investigation spread quietly among the professionals involved. Social workers checked in, counselors followed up, and Monroe ensured that the documentation was complete and ready for any legal or protective actions that might be required. Every visit, every review of records only reinforced what I had known all along. The truth, once properly documented and validated, could not be silenced. It was no longer a fragile hope or whispered secret. It was concrete, undeniable, and unstoppable. That night, I sat in my room looking at the X-ray once more. The jagged lines, once symbols of pain, now felt like a blueprint for empowerment. I realized that the fractures had done more than injure my wrist. They had exposed the fractures in our family structure, the hidden cracks in a household that had relied on silence and fear to function. The major revelation wasn't just that I had been harmed, it was that the truth could no longer be hidden. The evidence had leveled the playing field, and the next steps, the confrontation, the protection, and ultimately the pursuit of justice, were now unavoidable. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that change was possible. The proof was undeniable, the truth visible, and the silent battle that had been raging inside me for months now had the power to shape action. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be resistance and fear, but the fractures in my wrist, combined with the corroborating evidence, had created a turning point. The major revelation had arrived, and with it, the understanding that I was no longer powerless. The truth had emerged from the shadows, and it would no longer be ignored. The days following the major revelation were some of the most tense I had ever experienced. At home, Mark's subtle intimidation had evolved into something far more aggressive. He seemed to sense that his control over the household was slipping, and every interaction became a test of endurance. He would slam doors with exaggerated force, glare at me from across the room, and mutter under his breath about troublemakers and overreacting children. Vanessa, my mother, was caught in a storm of guilt and fear. She tried to intervene when possible, but her hesitation and repeated warnings, "Don't push him, Emily, you'll only make things worse," felt like chains around me. For the first time, I fully understood the true weight of a family secret. It wasn't just silence, it was the suppression of my voice, my safety, and my autonomy. Every step I took to protect myself and my siblings seemed to provoke more tension, more anger, and a growing sense of inevitability. One evening, after another tense exchange over dinner, Mark exploded in a way that left no doubt about the danger we were in. It started with a minor disagreement about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. His voice escalated almost immediately, moving from irritation to a low, menacing growl. He grabbed a plate from the counter, slammed it into the sink, and turned sharply toward me. I froze, my wrist throbbing, memories of the previous fractures flashing through my mind. He leaned closer, his shadow stretching across the kitchen floor, and muttered, "I don't know why you're always causing problems." The words were casual, but the weight behind them was anything but. I realized in that moment that the fractures, the X-rays, the documented evidence, and even Detective Monroe's intervention could not protect me if I remained silent. The risk of inaction had reached its peak. I retreated to my room that night, gripping my notebook like a lifeline. The pages were filled with documented incidents, medical reports, and personal observations. A silent army waiting for its moment. Yet, despite all the evidence, I felt a terrifying sense of isolation. My siblings looked to me for guidance and protection, but I was just as frightened as they were. I realized that protecting them meant making a choice that I had avoided for months, to speak the truth openly, fully, and without compromise. It wasn't enough to document, to gather evidence, or to whisper to outside authorities. The fracture, the pain, and the fear had culminated in a single, unavoidable decision. I had to confront the secret publicly, even if it meant shattering the fragile illusions that held our home together. The choice wasn't easy. I thought of the possible consequences. Mark's retaliation, Mom's disappointment, the upheaval that would follow. The thought of losing the life I had known, even if it had been filled with fear and control, was daunting. I could feel my pulse quicken, my chest tighten, and a mix of dread and determination settle over me. Every instinct told me to retreat, to maintain silence, to let someone else take action. But something deeper inside me refused. The fractures in my wrist, the bruises on my siblings, and the x-rays on Detective Monroe's desk were not just evidence. They were a call to action. To ignore them any longer would be to accept the cycle of abuse, to allow the family secret to continue unchallenged. The next morning, I woke with a resolve that surprised even me. I approached Mom first, gently placing a hand on her arm. "Mom," I said, my voice steady but soft, "we can't keep pretending anymore. I have to speak the truth. I have to protect Lily and Jason, and I can't do that alone." She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and hesitation. But I saw something else there, too. Recognition. She finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation, the reality that silence had enabled harm for too long. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "You're right, Emily. I I know. I've been wrong. I didn't know what else to do." That acknowledgement, so fragile, yet so vital, felt like a turning point. It wasn't enough for protection yet, but it was the first sign that Mom might stand with me rather than against me. Once Mom had agreed, the next step was confronting the pattern publicly, starting with those who could intervene and provide immediate protection. I contacted Detective Monroe again, recounting the most recent incidents in full detail, emphasizing the immediacy of the danger. She listened, her calm authority providing a stark contrast to the storm of fear and uncertainty at home. Monroe explained that the next steps would involve a formal investigation, protective measures for my siblings and I, and potential legal consequences for Mark. Hearing her outline the process solidified my understanding that choosing to speak was not just necessary, it was a lifeline. My decision to speak had set a chain of events in motion that could finally break the cycle of abuse. Returning home that afternoon, I felt the tension in the air like a living thing. Mark's subtle hostility had shifted. He seemed more aware, more cautious, as if he sensed a new force moving against him. I had chosen to speak, to let the truth be known, and the energy in the house had already begun to change. Mom's support, hesitant but present, added a fragile but vital layer of protection. I felt a mixture of fear and empowerment, the fear of what Mark might do in retaliation, but also the empowerment of finally claiming my voice, asserting my right to safety, and refusing to accept further harm. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the journey to this point. The fractures in my wrist, the secrecy, the subtle threats, and the growing tension had all led to this pivotal moment. Choosing to speak was not just about protecting myself. It was about breaking the cycle for my siblings and forcing acknowledgement of the reality that had been hidden for too long. I understood that the path ahead would be difficult, that there would be backlash, threats, and fear. But the decision had been made. Silence was no longer an option. I had reached the point of no return, and for the first time, I truly felt the weight and power of my own agency. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. The fractures, the fear, and the secrecy had been catalysts, but the choice to speak was my action, my turning point. The family secret, once a barrier that held us captive, was now exposed to the light. And with that exposure came the responsibility and the power to demand change. The moment of truth had arrived, and I had chosen to meet it head on.
The confrontation with Mark was inevitable, and it arrived in a way that left no room for ambiguity or denial. It was a Wednesday evening, and the air in our house carried a tension so thick it felt almost tangible. I had spent the afternoon with Detective Monroe, reviewing additional documentation, and receiving advice on protective measures, and I returned home with the resolve that I could not hide. Mom, unusually quiet, seemed to brace herself, as if she sensed the storm that was about to break. Mark, unaware of the depth of the preparation, was tinkering with his tools in the garage, humming softly under his breath. But the calm was a thin veneer, and I knew that once the truth met him head-on, the mask would drop. I found Mark in the living room later that evening, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but the way he straightened when I entered told me he sensed something had shifted. My wrist throbbed slightly beneath the cast, a reminder of the fractures that had brought us to this point. I took a deep breath, clutching my notebook, and said firmly, "Mark, we need to talk. It's time to stop pretending and face the truth about what's been happening." His eyes narrowed, and a muscle in his jaw tensed. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though his tone was more defensive than curious. I could feel the tremor in his voice, the first sign that the carefully constructed narrative he relied on for control was beginning to crumble. I laid out the facts as calmly and clearly as I could. I described the first fracture, the second fracture, and every subsequent incident that had revealed a pattern of abuse. I showed him the x-rays, medical reports, and the documentation I had meticulously collected over the past weeks. I explained the steps we had taken with Detective Monroe, the involvement of the school counselor, and the awareness that now existed beyond the walls of our home. Each piece of evidence was undeniable, concrete, and designed to leave no room for evasion. Mark's face hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line, and yet he could not dismiss the truth before him. The mask was slipping, revealing anger, frustration, and fear all at once. His first response was a flurry of denial, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. "You're exaggerating," he snapped, throwing his hands in the air. "This is ridiculous. None of this is true." But his voice carried none of the authority it once had. The proof was there. Images, notes, corroboration from outside authorities, and he could not erase it with words. I watched as he struggled to maintain composure, shifting from anger to attempts at intimidation, then to pleading for understanding, and finally to the stark realization that his usual methods were failing. The confrontation was raw, messy, and unlike anything I had experienced. Mom remained in the room throughout, her presence quiet but firm. She interjected only occasionally, mostly to insist that Mark remain calm and listen, her tone carrying both fear and newfound authority. "Mark, you need to hear this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Emily is telling the truth. We can't ignore it anymore." I could see the conflict in him, his attempts to maintain control colliding with the undeniable evidence and the joint authority of his own wife and the child he had harmed. It was the first time I saw fear in his eyes, fear not of being caught, but of losing the power he had relied on for so long. As the confrontation continued, Mark's anger gave way to a more desperate form of manipulation. He tried to twist the narrative, claiming accidents, claiming misunderstandings, claiming that we were betraying the family. But I remained steady, recounting each incident with clarity, refusing to let him redefine the reality I had painstakingly documented. Each rebuttal he offered only strengthened my conviction. Each attempt at intimidation only made me more resolute. I realized in that moment the confrontation was not about winning an argument. It was about standing firm in the face of fear, about letting the truth be seen and understood in its full force. The pivotal moment came when I referenced Detective Monroe and the formal documentation that existed outside of our household. "This isn't just about what I'm saying," I told him, my voice firm. "It's documented, verified, and undeniable. You cannot deny the evidence, and the authorities are aware." His shoulders slumped slightly, and the energy in the room shifted. The mask of control was gone, replaced by the stark reality of accountability. The confrontation, which had begun with intimidation and denial, had reached a point where the truth could no longer be avoided. After what felt like hours, the tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious quiet. Mark retreated to the garage, slamming the door behind him, leaving Mom and me in the living room. I felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and lingering fear. The confrontation had not resolved everything, but it had shattered the illusion of invincibility that had governed our household for so long.
The evidence, my resolve, and the external validation had forced the antagonist to acknowledge, if only internally, the reality he had tried to hide.
That night, I lay in bed reflecting on the confrontation. I realized that standing up to Mark, facing the antagonist directly, had been the hardest but most necessary step in the journey toward justice. The fractures in my wrist, the evidence, and my courage had combined to create a moment that could no longer be ignored. The confrontation was a turning point, a vivid reminder that the power of truth could outweigh fear, and that the act of standing firm in the face of danger was itself a form of empowerment. As I drifted off to sleep, I understood that the battle was far from over. There would be repercussions, difficult conversations, and continued tension. But the family secret had begun to unravel. The confrontation had exposed the lies, the manipulation, and the abuse for what it truly was, and in doing so, had set the stage for the final push toward justice. The antagonist had been faced with undeniable truth, and the first cracks of accountability had begun to appear. The days after the confrontation were heavy, with a sense of uncertainty and fear that clung to every corner of the house. Mark's presence became even more suffocating, though outwardly he pretended to maintain a semblance of normalcy. His anger, once overt and explosive, had transformed into a tense, simmering menace that made every interaction feel like walking on a tightrope. He was polite in a hollow, almost performative way, but the cold, calculating look in his eyes reminded me that the threat had not vanished. It had merely changed form. Mom tried to mediate, attempting to keep the peace and smooth over the tension, but the unease was palpable, and it was clear she was struggling to reconcile her loyalty to her husband with the undeniable reality of what had happened. Every day, I awoke with the gnawing anxiety that the smallest misstep might trigger a wave of retaliation, and the weight of protecting my siblings and myself felt almost unbearable. The emotional toll was immediate and relentless. I found myself replaying the confrontation in my mind, analyzing every word, every expression, and every gesture, wondering if I had said enough, if I had been strong enough, if I had done the right thing. My wrists, still healing from the fractures, throbbed as a constant reminder of the physical vulnerability I had endured. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake listening to the creaks and whispers of the house, imagining threats around every corner. Even small noises, a slammed cupboard, a creaking floorboard, sent my pulse racing. The fear was exhausting, both mentally and physically, and I began to doubt whether standing up to Mark had truly been worth it. The truth had been spoken, but the consequences were tangible and intimidating, and I was beginning to feel the crushing weight of what it meant to break the silence. Mom, meanwhile, was pulled in conflicting directions. She oscillated between fear of Mark's possible retaliation and guilt for the silence she had maintained in the past. I could see her hands shake as she tried to prepare meals, her eyes darting nervously whenever Mark walked by, and her voice quivered even when speaking to me. There were moments when I felt like I was alone in the fight, carrying the burden of truth on my shoulders, while trying to protect my siblings from the tension that saturated every room. I realized that courage wasn't simply about speaking, it was about surviving the fallout, enduring the backlash, and continuing to act in the face of fear. Every day was a test of resilience, a quiet battle between anxiety and determination. One evening, the situation escalated. Mark had been unusually quiet all day, and the stillness in the house felt suffocating. I was in the kitchen, helping Lily with homework, when he suddenly slammed his fist against the counter. The sound echoed through the house, making my heart leap into my throat. "You think you can control everything?" he snapped, his voice low and dangerous. My stomach churned, and I instinctively stepped back, clutching my wrist. Mom, who had been sitting nearby, intervened, her voice tight and pleading, "Mark, please, calm down. We're all just trying to live here." He ignored her, pacing the kitchen like a predator circling its prey. The confrontation wasn't physical this time, but the psychological strain was suffocating.
The fear, tension, and sense of powerlessness pressed down on me like a heavy fog, and for a moment I felt paralyzed by the reality of our situation. In those moments of fear, I began to question everything. Had speaking the truth truly been the right decision? Would the outside authorities be enough to protect us? Would the fractures, the evidence, and the validation be sufficient to withstand the storm of retaliation that had begun to brew? The questions were relentless, each one gnawing at my confidence and resilience. The truth, once empowering, now felt like a double-edged sword. Undeniable, yes, but also a catalyst for tension and fear. I understood then that bravery was not a single act, but a series of difficult, exhausting choices made under extreme pressure.
Amid the tension, my siblings became increasingly aware of the strain. Lily, once carefree and chatty, became quiet and hesitant, glancing nervously whenever Mark moved through the house. Jason, though younger, started clinging to Mom or me, his playful energy subdued by the tension in the air. I realized that the cost of speaking the truth extended beyond myself. It had become a responsibility to shield them from the emotional fallout, to act as both protector and advocate in a household that felt increasingly unsafe. The burden was heavy, and at times it seemed almost impossible to bear. Despite the fear and anxiety, there were moments of clarity. I kept my notebook close, reviewing documentation, x-rays, and notes, reminding myself of the undeniable reality that had been revealed. Detective Monroe's visits and guidance became a lifeline, a reminder that I was not entirely alone, and that the outside world recognized the gravity of our situation. The tangible support from authorities, combined with the growing acknowledgement from Mom, provided the faintest glimmer of hope amid the oppressive tension. It was in these moments that I understood that the dark night of the soul wasn't about the absence of fear, but about navigating fear while remaining committed to truth and justice. By the end of the week, I realized something profound. The backlash, the tension, and the isolation were not signs of failure, but evidence that the truth had power. The fractures, the confrontation, and the documentation had unsettled a foundation built on control and secrecy. And though the cost was high, the impact was undeniable. I understood that enduring this period of fear and uncertainty was necessary, a prelude to the final push for accountability and justice. The darkness was real, the stakes were high, and yet, amidst it all, a fragile but vital flame of determination burned inside me, a reminder that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The day of the official review arrived, and it carried a tension unlike anything I had experienced before. Detective Monroe had arranged for a meeting at the Child Welfare Office, involving social workers, a caseworker, and finally a formal statement from Mom and me. As we drove to the office, my stomach churned. My wrist throbbed faintly beneath the cast, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through me. Mom sat beside me, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, eyes focused straight ahead, as if drawing courage from the act of remaining composed. For weeks, the truth had been growing in potency, documented in notebooks, photographs, and x-rays, and now it was about to be presented to those with the authority to protect us. There was no turning back. When we arrived, we were led into a small conference room. The walls were lined with cabinets and muted posters about child protection, a stark contrast to the gravity of what was about to take place. Detective Monroe greeted us with a reassuring nod, her calm presence a stabilizing force amid the storm of nerves in my chest. A social worker, Miss Thompson, introduced herself, outlining the process with clear professionalism. We would recount the events, present the documentation, and answer any questions they had. The formality of it all made the stakes feel real. The safety of my siblings and myself rested on our ability to communicate the truth and provide evidence that could no longer be ignored. I began, recounting the fractures, the injuries, the repeated patterns of abuse, and the ways Mark had tried to intimidate and silence us. Each word carried weight, amplified by the evidence in my notebook and the x-rays Detective Monroe had collected.
As I spoke, I noticed Mom beside me, adding corroborating details in a soft, shaky voice, validating what I had endured and acknowledging her previous silence. Together, our testimony formed a narrative that was both painful and undeniable. The room remained silent for much of the presentation, the officials listening intently, taking notes, and occasionally nodding, as if affirming that the truth was not only being heard but was being fully understood. At one point, the caseworker asked to see the x-rays and the documentation again. Detective Monroe spread the materials across the table, the clear images of fractures, the detailed notes and photographs of minor bruises. The evidence spoke with a precision that words alone could not. I could feel a sense of validation rising in me, a quiet empowerment as the undeniable proof confirmed everything I had endured. For the first time, the truth wasn't just personal, it was being witnessed, recognized, and officially recorded. I glanced at Mom, whose eyes were moist with emotion, realizing that she too was processing the full weight of the revelation. She had moved from denial to acknowledgement and now to active advocacy, lending her voice to the fight for safety and justice. The tension peaked when we were informed that Mark had been summoned to the office, required to respond to the allegations. My heart raced as I imagined him confronting the tangible, irrefutable proof laid before the authorities. Detective Monroe remained calm, explaining that the process was designed to protect us and ensure that accountability could be enforced if necessary. It was surreal to realize that the man who had loomed over our lives, who had fractured my wrist and tried to keep the family secret intact, would now face the evidence without the ability to manipulate, intimidate, or silence. The roles had reversed. The truth was no longer ours to bear in isolation. It was visible, undeniable, and demanding consequences.
When Mark arrived, the room shifted. His usual air of control was gone, replaced by a mixture of defensiveness, indignation, and thinly veiled fear. He was presented with the evidence, asked to respond, and I could see the first cracks in the mask he had relied upon for so long. He tried to dismiss certain points, claim misunderstandings, and assert that the injuries were accidental, but each claim was met with the physical evidence, the corroborating testimony from Mom, and the methodical, professional questioning of the authorities. His attempts to regain dominance failed repeatedly, and I watched as the power dynamic that had ruled our home for years collapsed under the weight of truth. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that action would be taken. Protective measures for my siblings and me were immediately put in place, including monitoring, counseling, and temporary restrictions on Mark's access to the home. Legal proceedings were set into motion to ensure accountability and prevent further harm. As I left the office, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and cautious optimism settled over me. The confrontation, the documentation, the courage to speak, all of it had culminated in a formal recognition of the truth and a system poised to enforce protection and justice. On the drive home, Mom reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with tears, but also with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. "You were brave," she said softly. "We did the right thing. The truth is finally being heard." For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that change was possible, that the cycle of fear and secrecy could be broken. The fractures, the bruises, the nights of anxiety, they had all led to this point where the truth could no longer be denied and justice was set in motion. That night, lying in bed, I reflected on the journey. The fear, the documentation, the confrontations, and the painful moments of isolation had culminated in a moment where empowerment met action. The truth had been tested, validated, and placed on trial, and the system had recognized its weight. I felt the first real sense of safety in weeks, understanding that the journey toward justice was ongoing, but now firmly rooted in evidence, courage, and the undeniable reality of what had occurred. The final push had succeeded, and the trajectory of our lives was irrevocably changed.
The weeks following the official confrontation were a delicate balance between relief, adjustment, and the lingering traces of fear that had become a part of our daily lives. Protective measures were firmly in place. Social workers made regular visits, counseling sessions were scheduled for my siblings and me, and legal proceedings regarding Mark's actions had begun. At first, the presence of these systems felt intrusive, almost as if the house itself had been altered, made sterile and clinical. Yet beneath that discomfort was an undeniable sense of safety. For the first time in years, the fear that had permeated every corner of our home was being met with tangible, structured protection. And it was a relief so profound that it was almost disorienting. Mom and I navigated this new reality cautiously, aware that the transition from secrecy and denial to accountability required patience, awareness, and careful cooperation.
Counseling sessions became a cornerstone of our recovery. I attended regularly, both individually and with my siblings, guided by professionals who helped us process trauma and navigate the complex emotions that followed abuse. These sessions were sometimes difficult, forcing us to confront painful memories and articulate feelings we had long suppressed. But with each meeting, a sense of resilience began to form. I learned strategies to manage anxiety, techniques to rebuild trust, and ways to express emotions without fear of judgment or retaliation. Lily and Jason, too, began to emerge from the shadows of fear, gradually reclaiming the innocence and playfulness that had been overshadowed by tension in the household. Mom and I also took steps to repair and strengthen our relationship. The shared experience of confronting Mark and pursuing justice had created a bond built on trust, honesty, and mutual support. We spent evenings talking openly about the past, reflecting on what had been lost, and planning for the future. I began to see her not as a figure trapped in silence, but as a partner in advocacy, someone capable of learning, growing, and prioritizing the well-being of her children above all else. The dynamic between us, once strained by fear and complicity, transformed into one of collaboration and understanding, reinforcing the idea that courage could inspire change in others as well as oneself. As the legal and protective processes continued, there came a moment when the weight of the past began to lift. Mark faced formal consequences for his actions, including mandated counseling, restrictions on contact, and ongoing oversight by authorities. The certainty of accountability provided a profound sense of closure, though I understood that healing was an ongoing process rather than a single moment of resolution. The system had validated the truth we had spoken, reinforced the importance of speaking out, and ensured that protective measures would remain in place to prevent further harm. It was a triumph of courage, documentation, and advocacy over fear, secrecy, and manipulation. In the quiet moments at home, I began to notice subtle symbols of transformation, small acts of autonomy, like being able to walk freely through the house without flinching, or seeing my siblings play without fear, became markers of progress. Mom and I established routines that prioritized safety, emotional expression, and support, creating a structure that replaced fear with predictability and care. The fractures in our lives, once sources of pain and limitation, now served as reminders of resilience and strength. Each healed injury, each documented victory, and each act of courage reinforced the knowledge that change was not only possible, but inevitable when truth was pursued with persistence and integrity. By the end of the first month after the formal confrontation, the household had settled into a new equilibrium. The fear that had defined our daily lives was replaced with cautious optimism and the beginnings of emotional freedom.
Protective measures, counseling, and legal accountability provided a framework in which safety was no longer conditional. The fractures, once symbols of pain, now represented a turning point, a moment when truth prevailed, courage was validated, and the first steps toward a healthier, empowered life were firmly established. The days after the resolution felt surreal, as if our household had stepped out of the shadow of fear into a space where sunlight could finally reach the corners that had long been dark. The protective measures remained in place, but their presence was no longer a source of tension. It was reassurance. Mom had grown into her role as protector and advocate, participating in every step of our healing journey and finding her own strength in the process. I watched her reclaim authority not as an enforcer of control as Mark once had, but as a guardian guided by love, accountability, and empathy. Her voice, once hesitant and fearful, now carried clarity and determination. There was a profound transformation in her demeanor, and seeing that evolution reinforced my belief that courage could inspire change in those around you, even those who had once been complicit in silence. I too felt a shift that went deeper than the relief of safety or the satisfaction of justice. The fractures in my wrist, the scars of trauma, and the nights of anxiety had left physical and emotional marks, but they also served as tangible reminders of my resilience. For years, I had felt powerless, silenced, and trapped by circumstances beyond my control. Now, I understood that true empowerment wasn't simply about avoiding harm, but about confronting it, documenting it, speaking truth into the world, and insisting that justice be served. The process had not been easy. There had been fear, doubt, confrontation, and exhaustion. Yet each step had reinforced a critical lesson. The combination of courage and truth had the power to create transformation that was visible, undeniable, and lasting. My siblings, Lily and Jason, were beginning to blossom in ways I had never thought possible. The tension that had once muted their laughter and dulled their curiosity gradually lifted. They played freely, shared secrets without fear, and began to explore hobbies and interests that had been stifled by the oppressive atmosphere of the past. Moments that once seemed small, a board game in the living room, a spontaneous trip to the park, a quiet evening spent reading together, became markers of resilience, tiny but meaningful victories in reclaiming a childhood that had been overshadowed by fear. Watching them thrive reinforced my understanding that speaking the truth had not only protected me, but it had also safeguarded the possibility of joy and growth for those I loved most.
The physical space of our home began to feel different as well. Rooms that had been tense and quiet now carried a sense of calm and lightness. I found myself moving through the house without flinching, resting in spaces that had once felt threatening, and noticing details I had overlooked while trapped in survival mode. Each morning, as sunlight filtered through the windows, I experienced a small but profound gratitude for the normalcy that had been restored. The fractures that had once symbolized harm now represented turning points, moments when truth emerged from shadows and fear gave way to empowerment. The home was no longer a prison of silence. It was a foundation for healing and growth. Mom and I also began to think beyond our household. We shared our experiences with support groups and advocacy networks, offering guidance and encouragement to other families navigating the aftermath of abuse and secrecy. The story of our struggle, once private and isolating, became a tool to educate, inspire, and empower others. I realized that transformation wasn't just personal. It had ripple effects, influencing others to recognize the value of truth, the necessity of courage, and the power of taking action even in the face of fear. Our narrative, rooted in lived experience, had the capacity to create change beyond the walls of our home. As months passed, the legal consequences for Mark were finalized. Restrictions on contact were enforced, required counseling and oversight ensured accountability, and the knowledge that he could no longer manipulate or intimidate us provided a profound sense of closure. It was a reminder that systems could uphold justice when truth was presented with clarity and courage. The formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, combined with the protective measures, allowed Mom and me to focus on rebuilding not only our safety, but also our identities and relationships, grounded in honesty, empowerment, and mutual care. I began to reflect more on the journey, the fractures, the fear, the confrontations, and the nights spent wondering if speaking out was the right choice. Each of those moments had been a test of resilience, courage, and determination. Each had contributed to a narrative in which the truth emerged, accountability was enforced, and healing became possible. I understood that transformation wasn't instantaneous. It was a gradual process, punctuated by moments of clarity, empowerment, and recognition of what had been overcome. The person I had become was someone who could confront fear, act decisively, and advocate not only for myself, but for others in similar situations. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Mom, Lily, Jason, and I sat together in the living room. I watched my siblings play, Mom reading beside me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace and purpose. The fractures, bruises, and fear of the past were still a part of our story, but they no longer defined it. Instead, they had become the catalyst for transformation, a visible record of survival, courage, and the power of truth. I felt the weight of silence lift, replaced by a confident understanding that speaking out had not only preserved our safety, but had allowed us to reclaim our lives and shape a future defined by empowerment, care, and hope. I knew that the story didn't end with a single moment of triumph. Healing, advocacy, and empowerment were ongoing journeys, yet the transformation was undeniable. The fractures that had once signaled harm now symbolized resilience. The fear that had once governed our home had been replaced with safety and support. The silence that had once constrained us had been broken by courage and evidence. And most importantly, our voices, once muted, were now heard, validated, and used as instruments for protection, change, and hope. The family secret, once a source of shame and fear, had been dismantled, leaving in its place a life filled with possibility, empowerment, and purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.